July 1, 1916. 7:30 a.m.
On the Western Front, in the Somme region, northeast France, whistles sound simultaneously across hundreds of positions. 110,000 British soldiers emerge from their trenches.
In the next 30 minutes, 19,240 of them will be dead.
Over the next 141 days, approximately 1 million men would be killed, wounded, or go missing. This is the story of the Battle of the Somme, the bloodiest military operation in human history. And today, you're going to discover exactly what happened, why it happened, and how it forever changed the course of the First World War.
Over the next 40 minutes, you're going to fully understand the Battle of the Somme.
You'll meet the generals who planned this operation, particularly Douglas Haig, and understand their decisions, their objectives, and their critical mistakes. You'll hear real stories from soldiers who actually fought in this battle.
The Newfoundland Regiment that attacked Beaumont-Hamel. 720 men. 80% casualties in 30 minutes. The PALS battalions, units formed by men from the same town or neighborhood.
When they were destroyed, entire communities lost their entire generation of young men.
You'll understand why British tactics failed on the first day.
You'll see how 1.5 million artillery shells fired over 7 days left German bunkers virtually untouched. And you'll learn about the first use of tanks in combat, machines that would forever change warfare. But most importantly, you'll understand the human cost of this battle, nearly 1 million lives destroyed in just 141 days. If you want to truly understand the First World War, you need to understand the Battle of the Somme. To understand why the Battle of the Somme happened, you need to understand the situation in mid-1916. The First World War had begun in August 1914. We're now in 1916, 2 years later. 2 years of continuous fighting that had already cost hundreds of thousands of lives. On the Western Front, the war had crystallized into trench warfare. It was positional warfare. The quick lightning war everyone expected never materialized.
Instead, there was a stalemate. Whoever could wait the other side into complete exhaustion would win.
From 1914 to 1916, both sides had suffered massive losses. The British, in 1915, they lost hundreds of thousands in failed offensives. The Battle of Neuve Chapelle in March 1915 advanced just 2 kilometers at the cost of 13,000 casualties. The Battle of Loos in September lost another 50,000 men for insignificant gains. The French had already suffered over 1 million casualties by this point. The nation was bleeding. And in 1916, when the Battle of Verdun began in February, the French were attacked by Germans with massive force. Verdun would become a symbol of French resistance, but at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives again. The Germans, by late 1915, knew they were in an attrition war they couldn't win if it lasted many years.
Their economic resources were being consumed at alarming rates.
The British blockade was causing starvation at home.
They needed to end the war soon or face complete economic exhaustion.
The planning for the Somme emerged from this situation. The British and French planned a massive offensive to break German lines. The choice of the Somme was partly accidental. The Somme was a sector where British and French armies met. It wasn't necessarily the best place for an attack, but it was a compromise between the two allies. The British, under Douglas Haig, believed that a massive offensive could completely rupture German lines. General Henry Rawlinson had a more cautious approach: limited attacks, incremental gains.
Haig rejected caution. He believed that brute force, massive numbers, intense preliminary bombardment would be enough to break German defenses. The French, suffering at Verdun, insisted that an offensive on the Somme was necessary to relieve pressure. So the Somme was selected. Now let's move to the preparations. What happened in the months before the attack? In March 1916, troops began arriving in the Somme area.
The Fourth Army, under General Rawlinson, was designated the main force.
Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were moved to the region. Concentration camps were established.
Roads were constructed to support the massive flow of supplies. The terrain of the Somme was relatively flat, gently rolling. There were some ridges that offered defensive advantages. The Bazentin-Longueval Ridge would be particularly important. But overall, it was terrain with no obvious natural defensive features. The British conducted extensive reconnaissance.
Aircraft photographed German positions. Officers visited observation points to understand the layout.
On June 24, the British bombardment began.
This wasn't just any bombardment.
For 7 days, June 24 to June 30, British artillery fired continuously. The numbers were astronomical: 1.5 million shells fired in 7 days.
250,000 shells per day. Approximately 18,000 shells per hour. German trenches were transformed into muddy wastelands. Trees were uprooted.
Positions were seemingly dismantled. But there was one critical problem that nobody fully anticipated: the German bunkers, built 30 feet below ground, with reinforced concrete structure and 1 meter thick walls, survived the bombardment virtually intact. When the bombardment ended on the evening of June 30, the Germans knew the attack would come the next day.
British soldiers spent a tense night in the trenches, checking equipment, praying, writing letters home. At 7:30 a.m. on July 1, whistles sounded. 7:30 a.m., July 1, 1916. Whistles sound across hundreds of positions simultaneously.
British soldiers emerged from the trenches in straight, organized formations.
The orders were clear: walk, don't run. Maintain formation. Advance in waves. The tactical reasoning seemed sensible. If the British bombardment had destroyed German defenses as expected, walking in formation would allow better control of the attack. But there was a fatal problem: the German bunkers weren't destroyed. The Germans, in their bunkers 30 feet below ground, heard the bombardment cease. Officers immediately ordered their men up from the trenches, position the machine guns, and wait. Then they saw the British coming. 110,000 men walking across no man's land in straight formations, spaced a few meters apart, like a parade. As they advanced, German machine guns opened fire. German MG-08 machine guns, firing 600 rounds per minute. Not one machine gun. Dozens of them. Interlocking fields of fire. One survivor described, "We came out of the trenches like men on parade. Moments later, we were men falling dead on the ground." The machine guns never stopped. It was like the entire world was firing at us. Within minutes, the first British soldiers fell. Within 10 minutes, hundreds had fallen. Within 20 minutes, thousands. Those who managed to advance a few meters encountered an additional problem: German barbed wire hadn't been completely cut by the British bombardment. Soldiers became trapped in the wire, completely vulnerable to machine guns. One soldier trapped in the wire was described as riddled with bullet holes, his body absorbing dozens of rounds as the machine guns continued firing. Several sectors had particularly catastrophic losses. Beaumont-Hamel, the Newfoundland Regiment. Beaumont-Hamel was a heavily defended position in the north. The Newfoundland Regiment was ordered to capture it. Initial strength, 720 to 721 men. Attack time, 9:15 a.m., later than the general attack because they expected the battle would already be won. Result, total disaster. As the Newfoundland Regiment advanced across no man's land, they were decimated by German machine guns and artillery. Soldiers described bodies covering the entire field, men screaming, some trapped in the wire, others simply falling. When combat ceased, 619 to 710 soldiers casualties, numbers vary by source, 324 killed or missing presumed dead, 386 wounded, casualty rate, 80 to 91%, survivors fit to return to service, 68 men. Beaumont-Hamel was not captured. The Newfoundland Regiment ceased to exist as a fighting unit in one day. Sarah, multiple PALS battalions destroyed. Sarah was a heavily fortified village in the north. Several PALS battalions attacked: Barnsley PALS, 80 to 90% casualties, Bradford PALS, 80 to 90% casualties, Leeds PALS, 80 to 90% casualties. Sarah was not captured. It remained in German hands. The reason these numbers are so important is that these were PALS battalions, units specifically formed by men from the same town or neighborhood. When the Barnsley PALS was destroyed, the town of Barnsley was devastated. Virtually an entire generation of young men was killed or wounded in a single day. When the news reached the communities, it was traumatic. Fricourt and Mametz in the south, some modest advances were achieved. Fricourt and Mametz were partially captured. But the costs were high: thousands of casualties for gains of just a few kilometers. First day totals: British, 57,470 casualties, 19,240 killed, 35,493 wounded, 2,152 captured. French, 7,000 casualties, Germans, 8,000 to 12,000 casualties. The first day of the Somme was the bloodiest day in British Army history. No other day of battle resulted in such British losses. As sunset came on July 1st, reality set in. 57,470 British casualties in a single day. 19,240 of them would be dead. Many of the bodies would remain in no man's land for weeks, eventually rotting, because it was impossible to recover them under machine gun fire. Survivors emerged from the trenches, shocked. One soldier described, "There were no words. Just shocked silence. Everyone knew we had suffered a massive defeat, but no one wanted to admit it." British officers drafted reports for headquarters, communicating initial casualty numbers. When Haig received the numbers from the first night, his diary recorded, "The operation has progressed well, with modest gains." He didn't fully understand the scale of the disaster that had occurred. That night, British soldiers lay awake, traumatized, processing what had happened. An Australian soldier who would arrive at the Somme a week later wrote, "When we arrived, all we saw were temporary crosses. Crosses in rows, marking trenches filled with dead British." If you're finding this story absolutely fascinating and want to discover what happened during the 141 days of battle that followed, leave your like now. This helps YouTube's algorithm recommend this documentary to more people interested in military history. And if you want to follow this complete series of documentaries about the greatest battles of the First World War, subscribe to the channel. Now, let's see what happened in the weeks following the disaster of the first day. After the first day, you might have expected Haig to halt the offensive. He didn't. Despite massive losses, Haig believed a continued offensive could eventually break German defenses. So the battle continued. From July 2nd to 13th, the British attacked repeatedly. Some attacks achieved small advances. Fricourt was finally captured on July 2nd. Mametz was captured on July 3rd. But each gain cost thousands of lives. On July 7th, the 38th Welsh Division was ordered to capture Mametz Wood, a dense forest. This would become one of the most brutal combats of the first phase. Soldiers entered the wood where visibility was limited to a few meters. Hand-to-hand combat with bayonets and grenades. The 38th Division entered with 3,153 men. It lost over 4,000, many were reinforcements that arrived during combat. Casualty rate, 77%.
Mammoth's Wood was captured, but at the cost of effectively destroying the division as a fighting unit.
After 2 weeks of modest gains, Haig planned a new attack. The objective was the Byzantine-Longueville Ridge, a strategic position that offered defensive advantage to whoever controlled it. On July 14, several British divisions attacked. This time, there was a tactical difference. The attack was at dawn, with partial cover of darkness. This gave attackers the advantage of reduced visibility for the defenders. The result was more successful than the first day.
Soldiers managed to advance significantly. The villages of Byzantin-le-Petit and Byzantin-le-Grand were captured. Longueville was partially captured. For the first time, the British had achieved a significant tactical breakthrough. But there was no rapid exploitation. After capturing the ridge, the advance was consolidated rather than deepened.
The Germans counterattacked, and combat would continue in the region for weeks. More important, on this day occurred one of the last major uses of traditional cavalry in military history.
As British infantry advanced on the ridge, British cavalry was ordered to exploit the breach. The 20th Deccan Horse, Indian Cavalry, and 7th Dragoon Guards were sent to advance through broken German lines. Approximately 150 to 200 horsemen galloped toward German positions. The result was predictable and tragic. German soldiers with rifles and machine guns waited. As the horsemen approached, they opened fire.
Horses fell.
Riders were shot from their mounts. Approximately 8 British cavalrymen died, 100 plus were wounded. 130 horses were killed or wounded. The Germans, approximately 100 were killed or captured. From a military perspective, it was virtually without tactical effect. The Germans maintained their positions.
But historically, this charge effectively marked the end of the cavalry era in combat. Never again would traditional cavalry be used on a large scale in war.
It was a symbolic moment, the end of 500 years of cavalry warfare, replaced by the reality of the machine gun and modern artillery.
While the British consolidated gains on the Byzantine Ridge, another epic battle was unfolding in a nearby wood.
Delville Wood, Devil's Wood to the soldiers, was a forest that protruded as a dangerous salient in British lines.
The 1st South African Infantry Brigade was ordered to capture it and hold it at all costs.
The brigade entered the wood with 3,153 men. The Germans responded with incomparable ferocity. German artillery bombardment was launched on the wood, 400 shells per minute for 8 continuous hours. Soldiers described, like a rain of iron, the entire world exploding around us. Trees were shattered. Craters were created. Smoke was so dense that visibility was only a few meters.
But the South Africans held their positions.
As the bombardment ceased and German counterattacks began, South African soldiers, many already wounded, grabbed their weapons and defended themselves.
One account described soldiers in hand-to-hand combat with bayonets, grenades, and even rocks when ammunition ran out.
After 5 days of continuous combat, only 142 men from the original brigade emerged unscathed. Eventually, 720 more men were gathered, including wounded who returned and missing who were found. Total brigade casualties, 1,709 wounded, 763 killed.
Casualty rate, 77%. But Delville Wood was held by the Allies.
The Germans failed to retake the wood. Today, Delville Wood is a preserved monument. The trenches, bunkers, and machine gun positions are still visible.
A South African cross marks the memorial.
While British and South Africans fought for Delville Wood, Australian troops arrived at the Somme for their first major battle of the war. The 1st Australian Division was assigned to capture the village of Pozières and its distinctive windmill.
Pozières would become a symbol of Australian resilience and Australian suffering.
First attack, July 23, the 1st Australian Division attacked Pozières. They were met by concentrated German artillery and machine guns.
The attack failed with heavy losses, approximately 3,500 Australians casualties in one day. Second attack, July 29 to 31st, the 2nd Australian Division was ordered to capture the nearby windmill.
Again, they were met with intense fire.
The attack failed. Losses, 3,500 additional Australians.
Third attack, August 4, the 2nd Division tried again, this time with additional artillery and under cover of darkness. This time, they succeeded. The ruined windmill was captured after fierce hand-to-hand fighting among the stones of the destroyed building. But the price was extraordinary, 6,846 Australians lost just in the fight for the windmill. No Australian division before or after would suffer more losses in an equivalent time in the lines. Total Australian casualties at the Somme, 23,000 plus, 6,700 killed.
This in just 3 months of combat. One Australian soldier wrote, "Pozières was hell. Literal hell on earth. There's no adequate description of what it was like to be there." The trenches around Pozières became swampy in September when the rains began.
Soldiers literally sank in mud while German fire continued. But Pozières was held by the Australians, a symbol of their ferocity, but also of the incomparable cost. While epic combats occurred at Delville Wood and Pozières, another equally brutal battle unfolded at High Wood. High Wood, or Bois de Feroz in French, was a wood that protruded dangerously as a salient between British and German lines. The wood had been dense forest. British bombardment and artillery fire transformed it into a maze of shattered tree trunks, deep craters, and mud. First attempt, July 14, Highwood was attacked on the same day as the Byzantine Ridge. The British managed to enter the wood, but couldn't completely clear it. Combat was brutal, visibility was only a few meters between the trunks. Soldiers didn't know if the next men they saw were allies or enemies until they were face to face. Hand-to-hand combat with bayonets and grenades was the norm. Repeated attacks, July to September. Over the next 2 months, Highwood was attacked repeatedly. Each attack had a simple objective: clear the wood of enemies. No attacks achieved this completely. Estimated dead at Highwood, at least 8,000 British and German soldiers combined in just 2 months of combat. One British officer described Highwood as a corridor of death. No matter how we attack, we're repulsed. The Germans know every tree, every crater, every firing angle. We know nothing. Soldiers called Highwood 75 acres of hell. That name stuck. Final capture, September 15. Finally, on September 15, a new weapon was introduced: tanks. The Tank Mark I, the first use of tanks in combat in history, was sent against Highwood. Tanks advanced slowly across no man's land toward the wood. German soldiers, terrified by the unknown and terrifying machine, fled or surrendered. The tank managed to penetrate a few meters into the wood, destroying defensive positions. With the help of tanks and reinforced infantry, Highwood was finally captured on September 15. But the battle for the wood had cost over 8,000 lives for territory that could be crossed on foot in a few minutes. If you're absolutely absorbed by this story of courage, sacrifice, and incomparable horror, leave your like and share this video. Sharing stories like this, stories of real soldiers who faced incomparable horror, is important so that history is not forgotten. Subscribe to the channel to see in-depth documentaries about other epic battles, because the Somme wasn't the only terrible battle of this war. Now, let's see the first use of a technology that would forever change warfare. September 15, 1916 marks a memorable date in military history. It's the day of the first use of tanks in combat in human history. The British had secretly developed a new vehicle, the Tank Mark I. It was a strange machine: 28 tons of weight, steel armor, movement by tracks, multiple armament. Specifications: length, 9.3 meters, weight, 28 tons, maximum speed, 4 miles per hour, or 6.4 kilometers per hour, armament, 2 6-pounder cannons, male version, or multiple machine guns, female version, crew, 6 men. The tank was designed to cross no man's land, navigate over shell craters, break through barbed wire, and overcome trenches. Attack at Flers-Courcelette. September 15, the attack was launched against the villages of Flers and Courcelette. Of the 49 Mark I tanks available, only 15 managed to enter no man's land. Several broke down mechanically, some got bogged down, some were damaged by artillery, but those 15 tanks that managed to advance had a devastating effect. The Germans, seeing these strange and terrifying machines advancing toward them, fled or surrendered. A German report described, the men panicked when they saw the iron machine advance. Some abandoned their positions. Others surrendered without firing. The tanks achieved an advance of approximately 2,500 yards, 2.3 kilometers, significantly more than previous attacks. Problems of early tanks. Despite relative success, tanks had serious problems: very slow mechanism, 4 miles per hour maximum, often 2 to 3 miles per hour in mud, too slow to fully exploit any breakthrough, limited vision for crew, small openings, limited fuel, range of a few miles, very hot inside, up to 50 degrees Celsius in warm weather, vulnerable to anti-tank artillery if overturned, crew very slow to exit. One tank was damaged and its crew captured by the Germans. The Germans studied the captured tank and began developing anti-tank defense, mainly directed artillery. Haig's assessment: despite mechanical problems, Haig recognized the extraordinary potential of tanks. His diary recorded, wherever tanks advanced, we took our objectives. Where they didn't advance, we failed. I told the War Department, go back and make as many tanks as you can. This assessment proved prophetic. Tanks would become the decisive weapon in future battles. The Battle of Cambrai in 1917 would use hundreds of tanks in massive concentration. Tanks would revolutionize future warfare, but not before many more died in the First World War. After the relative success of the first tank on September 15, the battle continued. But something was changing: the weather. From June to August, the weather was relatively dry. Soldiers suffered from heat, dust, but the terrain was at least navigable. In mid-September, rains began. The rains were light at first, occasional rain that dampened the ground. But in September, the rains intensified. Heavy rains began falling regularly. What happened next transformed the entire character of the battlefield. The Somme battlefield, after months of bombardment, was a mosaic of shell craters. There were literally thousands of them, some so densely grouped that the terrain looked like Swiss cheese. When the rains came, these craters filled with water. Soldiers described water in every crater, some up to 10 feet deep. If you fell into one, you could drown. The trenches, already muddy, transformed into quagmires. One soldier wrote, we stood in mud up to our thighs. When it rained, the mud rose to our waists. Hours we'd spend in it while German fire continued. The mud wasn't simple mud. It was clay-like, sticky, virtually impossible to clean. Men described it as liquid cement. Once you sank in, it was almost impossible to get out. One account described a soldier who fell in deep mud during the night. By morning, despite efforts to save him, he had sunk even deeper. He was left behind when the unit withdrew, presumably to die gradually in the mud. Trench foot and other conditions besides mud, soldiers suffered from trench foot, a disease resulting from being in continuous cold water. Feet swell, become discolored, dark blue or black, and hurt intensely.
Severe cases result in amputation. Medical service reports list thousands of cases of trench foot in October-November 1916.
Lice, virtually universal. One source described lice in such large numbers it's impossible to kill them fast enough.
Rats, giant black rats fed on unburied corpses in no man's land.
One soldier described waking with a rat walking across his face.
Pneumonia and bronchitis, cold, wet weather resulted in widespread respiratory disease.
Dysentery, contaminated water in shell craters caused gastrointestinal infection. Despite these conditions, the battle continued.
Haig insisted the offensive proceed.
He still believed complete breakthrough was possible. As October turned to November, the temperature dropped.
Rain transformed into occasional snow. More worrying, freezing.
Soldiers had to adapt to a new set of challenges.
Trench foot intensified in the cold. Frostbite was a new danger. Men suffered frostbite on fingers, ears, noses. Severe cases of frostbite resulted in amputation.
One soldier described, "Your fingers turn white, then blue, then black.
If you're lucky, only the finger is amputated. If not, the whole foot." Combat conditions became even worse.
Trenches that were in mud were now in ice covered with frozen mud.
Movement was almost impossible.
One soldier described, "You try to walk and each step was a struggle. The frozen mud stuck to your boots, adding pounds of weight.
And if you fell, well, getting up was a battle in itself."
Battlefield transformed. The battlefield in October-November was unrecognizable from June-July. In June-July, dry, or dusty, terrain, clear visibility, sky often sunny. In November, deep mud, frozen mud, occasional snow, poor visibility, sky almost always cloudy.
Large-scale offensive operations became virtually impossible. Haig, recognizing this, finally planned a final offensive before total winter made operations impossible.
If this story of human determination in the face of impossible adversity has impacted you, now is the perfect moment to leave your like. Leaving a like helps YouTube's algorithm show this documentary to millions of other people who also love authentic and in-depth history. More than 1 million people died or were wounded at the Somme. If you know their story and share it with others, their memory won't be forgotten.
Subscribe to the channel now. With weather worsening and winter approaching, Haig planned the battle's final attack. Remaining objectives included Beaumont-Hamel, site of the Newfoundland Regiment massacre on the first day, Sarah, Beaucourt, other minor positions. These positions had resisted the entire battle.
They were still in German hands after 3.5 months of combat. Operations of November 13 to 18. November 13, 5th British Army under General Hubert Gough attacked. Saint-Pierre-Divion was captured after fierce combat. Beaumont-Hamel was partially captured November 14. Beaucourt was captured after intense fighting. Soldiers advanced through mud and snow November 15 to 17. Sarah still resisted. Combat continued on several fronts. Gains were modest, a few hundred meters. Costs remained high. November 18, officially ND on the morning of November 18. 51st Highland Division finally captured Beaumont-Hamel. This was the last major operation of the battle. Battlefield was covered in snow and ice. Large-scale operations were impossible. Reasons for conclusion: 1. Weather, freezing, snow, impractical conditions. 2.
Exhaustion. Both armies had suffered massive losses. 3. Diminishing gains. Each attack resulted in smaller and smaller gains. 4. Difficult resupply. Mud and snow made resupply nearly impossible. 5. Morale. Soldiers were at their psychological limit. Final battle results: British, 419,654 total casualties, 73,412 killed, 246,000 plus wounded, 100,000 plus missing/captured, territory conquered, 6 to 7 miles depth, 20 miles of front, objectives not achieved, Peronne. Bapaume remained in German hands. French, 194,451 total casualties, modest gains in the south, diminished role as battle progressed. Germans, 450,000 to 600,000 estimated, numbers not fully disclosed, army severely worn down. Offensive capability reduced. Historical assessment, Allied tactical victory? Yes, territory was conquered, German defense was broken at points. Strategic victory? Questionable. Ambitious objectives were not achieved. Victory in terms of attrition? Perhaps. German army was severely worn down. Overall failure? From a certain perspective, 1 million casualties for modest territorial gain?
The battle is remembered as one of the greatest military disasters in history, and at the same time, as an example of human determination in the face of impossible adversity. The Battle of the Somme taught crucial military lessons that would shape the rest of the war. Lessons learned: 1. The futility of massive frontal attack against defense in depth. British first-day tactics, massive frontal attacks in straight formation, proved disastrous against well-prepared German defenses. This was an expensive lesson paid in blood. 2. Importance of creeping barrage. The British learned the importance of a mobile artillery curtain that advanced immediately before infantry. This would give attackers protection against machine gun fire. At the Battle of Ypres in 1917, General Plumer would use creeping barrage with enormous success. 3. Tank development. Despite initial problems, tanks proved the concept. Later versions, Mark II, Mark III, and beyond, would be developed. At Cambrai in 1917, hundreds of tanks were used in massive concentration, the first large-scale tank attack. This would demonstrate the transformative potential of armored technology. For the value of darkness in offensive operations, dawn attacks with partial cover of darkness, like at Bazentin Ridge on July 14, were significantly more successful than attacks in full daylight. This lesson was incorporated into future operations. 5. Need for consolidation. After tactical success, several successful attacks failed to fully exploit advantage because reserves weren't available or were disorganized. Future planning would emphasize the need to maintain momentum with available reserves. Impact on the First World War. 1. Didn't determine the war's outcome. Despite the scale of the battle, it wasn't decisive. The war would continue for 2 more years. 2. German attrition. The wearing down of the German army at the Somme contributed to its eventual exhaustion. But it wasn't enough for final defeat in 1916. 3. British confidence shaken. The first day was an emotional shock to the British army. Confidence in leadership was shaken. Criticism of Haig began gaining strength among politicians and the public. 4. Resurgence of infantry as primary weapon. Despite emphasis on artillery and tanks, infantry remained the most important weapon. Future plans would continue to emphasize well-trained and well-tacticked infantry. Today, the Battle of the Somme is commemorated in several ways. Monuments and memorials. Thiepval Memorial, largest CWGC, Commonwealth War Graves Commission, Memorial, monumental arch of red brick and stone, inscribes the names of 72,000 plus missing from the battle, visited by hundreds of thousands annually. Beaumont-Hamel Battlefield preserved as Canadian National Monument, trenches, bunkers, and craters still visible, visited by tourists from around the world. Site of annual remembrance ceremonies. Delville Wood, South African Memorial, preserved. Woodworth Museum, annual South African remembrance ceremonies. Posiers, Australian Memorial, tall monument marking the site. Australians visit to honor sacrifice. Military cemeteries, 400 plus CWGC cemeteries in the Somme region, hundreds of thousands of names inscribed, carefully maintained for generations. Ceremonies and remembrance. July 1st is a date of special significance in Great Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, especially Newfoundland, whose regiment suffered catastrophic losses. Annual ceremonies occur at Thiepval, Beaumont-Hamel, and other sites. Cultural impact. 1. Poetry and literature. Soldiers like Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and Robert Graves wrote dramatically honest poetry about the war. Owen wrote, "If you could hear the sound of rifles, you would never have that childish dream again." 2. Film. The Battle of the Somme, 1916, was a contemporary documentary that reached 20 million people in the first months. 3. Fiction. Countless novels were written about the battle. All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Maria Remarque touches on the battle. For education. The Battle of the Somme is taught in schools around the world as an example of the futility of war. Historical perspective changed. Immediately post-war, battle was seen as necessary, part of Allied victory. 1920s to 1940s, criticism increased. Lloyd George attacked Haig harshly. Battle began to be seen as a symbol of futility. Modern perspective, historians debate. Some argue Somme was a genuine attrition victory. Others argue the cost was unsustainable. Some surprising facts about the Battle of the Somme you may not have known. Fact 1. The Newfoundland Regiment lost more men in one day than in all of World War II. 710 men lost on July 1, 1916. Newfoundland suffered fewer losses in all of World War II, approximately 300 killed. Fact 2. The Lochnagar mine can still be seen today. Detonated on July 1, it created a crater 100 meters wide and 21 meters deep. The crater remains visible at La Boisselle, France, as a lasting monument. Fact 3. Geoffrey Malins captured the Hawthorne Ridge explosion on film, one of the most iconic images of World War I. The explosion at Hawthorne Ridge on July 1 was captured on film. Fact 4. Geoffrey Malins. The Battle of the Somme was seen by 20 million in 6 weeks. The 1916 documentary showed actual combat scenes. It was a cinema phenomenon. Fact 5. The last cavalry charge occurred here July 14. British cavalry, 20th Deccan Horse and 7th Dragoon Guards, charged against German positions. Approximately 8 British cavalrymen died, 100 plus wounded, 130 horses lost. Fact 6. Haig never saw the battlefield before. The battle commander-in-chief Douglas Haig never visited the Somme sector before January 1916. His command was from the rear, far from combat. Fact 7. First use of tanks in combat. September 15, 1916, Mark I tanks were used in combat. Only 15 of 49 managed to enter action. But they would revolutionize future warfare. Fact 8. PALS battalions destroyed entire communities. Battalions formed by men from the same town, Accrington, Sheffield, Barnsley, etc., suffered 80 to 90% casualties in one day. When the news reached home, entire towns were traumatized. A whole generation of men was lost. Fact 9. Weather radically transformed the battle from June-July, dry, hot, to October-November, mud, snow, freezing. The battlefield was transformed into a quagmire. Fact 10. The battle lasted exactly 141 days. July 1 to November 18, 141 days of virtually uninterrupted combat. The Battle of the Somme was more than a battle. It was a defining moment in human history. It represented something that had never happened before on the scale scene: massive industrial death. Previous wars, even large wars, had casualties countable in tens of thousands. Somme, casualties countable in hundreds of thousands. In 141 days. For territory measurable in kilometers. Fundamental change in warfare. The Battle of the Somme marked the point where it became clear that the First World War wouldn't be resolved by dramatic breakthrough or charging cavalry.
It would be resolved only by exhaustion, by whoever could absorb more death and keep fighting. This was the new reality of modern warfare. Tanks would appear. Aviation would appear. Tactics would improve. But the fundamental reality remained death on an incomparable scale. Psychological impact on Western civilization. Before Somme, there was still hope that the war would end quickly, that there would be clear victory. After Somme, it became clear that the war was endless futility. This shift in perspective would transform art, literature, philosophy, and politics of the 20th century. The war poets Owen, Sassoon, Graves would express this despair. Wilfred Owen, what voice is holier than the voice of truth? None. And what truth is more sacred than the truth of death? None. This was the post-Somme perspective. Political legacy. The Battle of the Somme shook political confidence in Commander Douglas Haig. Lloyd George, who would become Prime Minister, would harshly attack Haig in military command. Debates about the necessity of war would intensify. Pacifist movements would gain strength. This political transformation would lead to changes in how war would be conducted. Modern perspective. Today, Somme is a symbol of futility, sacrifice, and human determination simultaneously. There's no consensus on whether it was necessary, whether it was well executed, whether the price was justified. But there's universal consensus, it was transformative. It was the point where the innocence of 1914 warfare died definitively. If this documentary touched you, if the story of 1 million people suffering and dying for honor, for country, for comrades moved you, then now is the moment to leave your like. Leaving a like is a simple way to honor the memory of these men. It's a way of saying, your story won't be forgotten. Subscribe to the channel. Activate notifications. Because soon, I'll bring more stories of epic battles that transformed the world. Coming soon, the Battle of Verdun, where French and Germans would face each other in an equally devastating offensive. But for now, we have the story of the Somme. We have the story of 1 million people who suffered in hell, but maintained their humanity. Their names may have been forgotten. But their story, their sacrifice, their determination, this will remain forever. When we look at the Battle of the Somme today, 108 years later, it seems impossible. How were 1 million people mobilized? How did 1 million suffer? How did society continue after this? And yet, it continued. The survivors returned home. Some able to resume normal life. Many would never fully recover. The families who lost sons continued. Not because they wanted to forget, they could never forget, but because it was necessary to continue. The communities that lost their generation of young men rebuilt themselves, slowly, painfully. Great Britain, which lost 420,000 men, continued being a superpower but would never be the same. The First World War, which Somme represents in its most brutal form, would continue for 2 more years. 9 million more would die before the end. But Somme remains, in historical memory, as the peak, the point where futility became undeniable. If there's a lesson from Somme for us today, it's this: war has an incomparable cost. Soldiers are people with families, friends, full lives ahead. Each death is a tragedy. Each wound is suffering. And the Battle of the Somme, with its 1 million casualties, is eternal witness to this truth. Now you know the story of the Somme, the true, complete, in-depth story. You know the names: Haig, Rawlinson, Newfoundland, Australians, South Africans. You know the places: Beaumont Hamel, Delville Wood, Pozières, High Wood, Somme. And you know the price: 1 million lives. This is the story of the Battle of the Somme. Thank you so much for watching to the end. And see you in the next documentary.